The Sterling Foundation Gala at the Plaza Hotel had the kind of quiet grandeur that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across a ballroom filled with 650 guests, senators who controlled appropriations committees, CEOs whose decisions moved markets, celebrities whose faces sold magazines. The air carried the scent of Casablanca lilies and old money, that particular fragrance of power accumulated over generations and laundered through charitable foundations. Naomi Sterling stood at the podium in a midnight blue Valentino gown that had cost more than most people earned in a year, though she had chosen it not for the price but because the color reminded her of her mother's favorite dress. At 7 months postpartum, her body had returned to something resembling its former shape, though she carried herself differently now. Not the careful invisibility of her marriage years, but the centered stillness of someone who had tested themselves and discovered bedrock beneath the surface. The teleprompter scrolled upward, but she barely glanced at it. She had written this speech at 3 a.m. while Grace slept in her bassinet, and the words had come from somewhere deeper than strategy. "Tonight is about value," she began, her voice carrying across the silence that had fallen the moment she approached the microphone. Not the value of a stock portfolio or a piece of real estate, but human value, the kind that doesn't appear on a balance sheet. In the shadows near the kitchen service entrance, a man in an ill-fitting waiter's uniform stood frozen with a silver tray of champagne flutes. The jacket pulled too tight across his shoulders and the pants stopped an inch above his ankles. Tristan Ashford had taken this job through a temp agency for $100 cash, enough to cover groceries for the week if he stretched it. The agency hadn't mentioned whose gala he would be serving. He watched the woman at the podium, the woman he had once called his wife, and felt something collapse behind his sternum. She was glowing, not the manufactured radiance of professional styling, but the genuine luminescence of someone who had walked through fire and emerged holding what mattered. Too often we measure people by the labels on their clothes rather than the content of their character, Naomi continued. We mistake price for worth. We confuse what someone has with who someone is. Tristan's hands trembled and the champagne glasses clinked against each other with a sound like small bells. The head caterer shot him a warning glare from across the service station. One mistake and he would be dismissed without pay. And he needed that $100 more than he had ever needed anything. But to understand how a vice president became a waiter, how a woman who served coffee in a Connecticut diner became the face of a $10 billion empire, how 3 years of patience transformed into one night of reckoning, the story requires going back. 5 years back, to a hospital room in Chicago, where a self-made billionaire lay dying and made his daughter a promise that would reshape both their lives. The machines monitoring Elijah Sterling's failing heart produced a steady rhythm that would soon fall slint. He had built his fortune the hard way, janitor to property manager to real estate developer to something approaching royalty in the world of commercial holdings. 40 years of 16-hour days of seeing opportunities where others saw only problems, of understanding that patience was the rarest commodity in a world addicted to instant gratification. His daughter sat beside his bed, holding his hand with a grip that wanted to anchor him to life through sheer force of will. Naomi was 29, working 3 jobs to cover rent on a studio apartment. Unaware that her father's estate would make her one of the wealthiest women in America. He had kept it from her deliberately, the same way he had kept his fortune hidden during her entire childhood, wanting her to develop character in the crucible of necessity rather than the greenhouse of privilege. "Baby girl," his voice barely rose above the whisper of the ventilator. "I need you to promise me something." She leaned closer, tears tracking down her cheeks. "Anything. The money, the trust. Edward Pierce will handle everything." He paused, gathering strength. "But it comes with a condition." "Dad, I don't care about conditions. I just want you to listen." His grip tightened with surprising strength. 5 years. You have 5 years to find someone who loves you without knowing. Someone who sees Naomi, not the sterling fortune. That's impossible. How am I supposed to? You'll hide it. Live like you've been living. And when you turn 34, the trust activates. Then you choose. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that demanded she understand. Choose if they passed the test, if they loved you when you had nothing. And if they didn't, something shifted in his expression, a flash of the ruthless strategist who had built an empire from a janitor's wages. Then you'll know what to do. I've prepared for every possibility. Trust Edward. He'll know when it's time. The monitor's rhythm stuttered, recovered, stuttered again. Naomi felt the moment approaching, that terrible threshold beyond which no amount of money or power or desperate bargaining could reach. Patience, baby girl. His voice dropped to almost nothing. Patience is the most expensive thing in this world to own. Most people can't afford it. They want everything now, today, this instant. But the people who can wait. His lips curved into a smile that held 40 years of hard-won wisdom. The people who can wait can have everything. Promise me you'll wait for someone real, she promised. 2 hours later, the rhythm stopped. 4 years after that promise, Naomi stood in her studio apartment staring at a letter from Pierce and Associates that had arrived via certified mail. The return address meant nothing to her. The contents rewrote her understanding of reality. The trust her father had established contained holdings in commercial real estate across 47 states, equity positions in 16 publicly traded companies, private investments in emerging technologies, and cash reserves that could fund a small nation's annual budget. The total exceeded $10 billion. The letter explained the 5-year condition, the requirement that she find authentic love before the money became hers. The elaborate structure Elijah had created to ensure she would never be certain if someone wanted her or her inheritance. She read it 3 times, sitting on a futon purchased from a thrift store, wearing scrubs from her evening shift at the diner, unable to reconcile the numbers on the page with the water-stained ceiling above her head. Edward Pierce's phone number appeared at the bottom. She called. "Miss Sterling." His voice carried the warmth of someone who had known her father well. "I've been expecting this call for 4 years. Your father made me promise not to contact you first. He wanted you to have time to live your life before the weight of this knowledge changed it." "This is insane. $10 billion? My father was a janitor. I grew up wearing hand-me-downs and eating government cheese." "Your father was many things. A janitor was simply where he started. He never wanted you to grow up knowing wealth. He believed privilege without struggle created weakness. He wanted you to develop strength first." She looked around her apartment, 400 square feet of peeling paint and temperamental plumbing. "And now? Now you have a choice. Accept the inheritance with its conditions, or refuse it and continue as you are. But Miss Sterling, Naomi, your father believed you deserved to know if someone could love you for yourself. Not for the fortune, not for the doors it opens, just you." The words settled into her bones like a challenge. For 4 years she had grieved her father while working herself to exhaustion, believing she was alone in the world. Now she discovered she had never been alone, that he had been preparing for this moment even as his heart failed. "The trust activates when I turn 34? "Correct. You have 1 year remaining. Your father's will suggests you use that time to test the waters, as it were. See if you can find someone genuine." "And if I can't?" Edward's pause carried weight. "Then you'll have $10 billion and the wisdom to know that authentic connection exists, even if you haven't found it yet. Your father's letter to you, I'm authorized to send it once you accept the terms. But Naomi, he wrote something else, something I think you should hear now." "What?" He said, "She'll want to save them. Let her try. But when she calls, answer immediately." Edward let that sink in. Your father knew you. He knew you would give someone every chance, and he prepared for the moment when you realized those chances had run out. 3 years before the Sterling Foundation Gala. 3 years before Tristan Ashford would stand in an ill-fitting waiter's uniform watching his ex-wife command a room of power brokers. Naomi walked into a coffee shop near Northwestern University to use their Wi-Fi and apply for a weekend housekeeping position. She never made it to the application. A man in a charcoal suit, expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of tailoring that whispered rather than announced, stood at the counter juggling his phone, briefcase, and a large coffee. The coffee lost. It arced through the air in what felt like slow motion directly toward the laptop Naomi had just opened on a corner table. He lunged, knocked the cup away from her computer and sent it splashing across his own jacket instead. The coffee was black, hot, and immediately began staining the wool a shade darker than the original gray. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" His concern seemed genuine, focused on her rather than his ruined jacket. "I'm fine. Your suit, though. It's just a suit." He grabbed napkins, began dabbing uselessly at the spreading stain. "Your laptop. Did any get on it?" She checked. The computer was old, held together with electrical tape and prayers, but completely dry. "No, you saved it." "Thank God. Look, let me pay for any repairs if the keys stick or anything." "It's fine. Really, you took a coffee bath to protect my ancient dinosaur of a computer. I think I came out ahead." He looked at her then, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. Later she would remember this moment as the one where everything might have turned out differently. When Tristan Ashford looked at a woman in thrift store jeans and a faded Northwestern sweatshirt and saw something worth pursuing. "I'm Tristan." He extended his hand, still damp with coffee. She took it. "Naomi. Naomi, I know this sounds like a line, but I'd really like to make this up to you. Can I buy you dinner? Somewhere nice enough that you'll forget I'm the idiot who weaponized coffee?" She should have said no. Should have remembered Edward Pierce's warning that the test had already begun, that anyone she met from this moment forward existed in the liminal space between genuine connection and calculated approach. But Tristan's smile carried no agenda she could detect, and the way he kept checking her laptop for damage suggested someone who cared about things that mattered to other people. Dinner would be nice. That first evening stretched into 8 months of careful courtship. Tristan worked as a coordinator at his family's logistics company, a position he described with self-deprecating humor as professional email forwarding with occasional spreadsheet management. He drove a sensible sedan, lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, and seemed genuinely content with a life that didn't include yachts or private jets or any of the trappings Naomi had discovered through careful research that his family's company could theoretically support. He brought her coffee in the mornings, remembered how she liked her eggs, left small notes in her jacket pockets when they spent weekends together. The notes contained quotes from books she loved, badly drawn cartoons that made her laugh, reminders that he was thinking of her even when they were apart. 8 months in, they drove to Wisconsin for a weekend at a bed and breakfast that cost less per night than Tristan probably spent on lunch during the work week. They hiked through state parks, watched the sunset over a lake whose name neither of them could pronounce, and lay on a dock counting stars that the light pollution of Chicago never allowed them to see. "I love you." His voice carried across the darkness between them, simple and direct. She turned her head, studied his profile against the starlight. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you organize your books by color because it makes you happy even though it's completely impractical. I know you can't watch sad movies without crying, but you'll watch them anyway because you think stories should be allowed to hurt. I know you fall asleep reading and wake up with pages stuck to your face." He rolled onto his side, facing her. "I know when you smile. Really smile, not the polite version. Your whole face changes, and I know I want to see that smile every day for the rest of my life." The proposal came with an $800 ring purchased on a payment plan, presented on the same dock under the same stars. Naomi looked at the simple band with its modest stone and felt her father's test crystallize into sharp focus. This was it. This was the moment that would determine whether Elijah Sterling's faith in authentic human connection was justified or merely the romantic delusion of a dying man. She said yes. The wedding took place at a courthouse with Edward Pierce and Carmen Ortiz, her college roommate and the only person besides Edward who knew about the inheritance, as witnesses. Tristan's family attended, though Vivian Ashford's expression throughout the ceremony suggested she was attending a funeral rather than a celebration. Vivian Ashford had been born Vivian Chen to parents who worked in a laundromat and lived above it. She had clawed her way into a better life through calculated charm and strategic marriage, transforming herself from the daughter of immigrants into the matriarch of a respectable Connecticut family. Through sheer force of will and careful curation of her past, she understood the importance of appearances, of bloodlines, of maintaining the social architecture that separated people of quality from people of circumstance. And she knew, with the instinct of someone who had bootstrapped her way up from nothing, that Naomi Brooks, as she had introduced herself, using her mother's maiden name, represented a threat to everything Vivian had built. "Welcome to the family, Naomi." Vivian's embrace at the reception held all the warmth of a business transaction. "I'm sure you'll fit in eventually." Across the room, Lawrence Ashford pulled his son aside, voice low but not quite low enough. "Son, are you certain about this? Her people—" "Dad." Tristan's jaw tightened. "I love her, that's enough. Love is a fine foundation, but you need to think practically. What does she bring to the marriage? What doors does she open?" "She brings herself, that's all I need." Lawrence sighed, the sound of a man who had tried to impart wisdom and failed. "I hope you're right." The first year of marriage passed in a slow erosion of small moments. Vivian's comments arrived wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. At family dinners, she would suggest Naomi might be more comfortable helping in the kitchen, given her background. At the country club, she would express worry that these events might be overwhelming for someone not accustomed to such settings. Tristan started arriving home later, citing meetings with his mother about company business. He stopped holding Naomi's hand in public, a change so gradual she couldn't identify when it began, only that one day she reached for his fingers and felt him stiffen, glance around to see who might be watching, then thread his hand through hers with a tension that hadn't existed before. The second year brought pregnancy. Naomi discovered it on a Tuesday morning. 3 positive tests lined up on the bathroom counter like an accusation or a blessing, depending on perspective. She told Tristan that evening over dinner at a restaurant they could barely afford, watching his face cycle through surprise to something that looked like hope, before settling into careful neutrality. "We should tell Mother," his first words, not celebration or fear or any of the emotions she had expected. "We could wait, just enjoy it being our secret for a little while. Mother will want to help. She has connections for the best doctors, the right schools. We should tell her this weekend." The announcement happened at Sunday dinner. The Ashford family gathered around a table that could seat 12 but rarely hosted more than the 5 of them. Vivian, Lawrence, Tristan, his sister Sloane, and Naomi perpetually at the end, the seat that received the least attention and the coldest drafts. Vivian's fork paused halfway to her mouth when Tristan shared the news. The pause lasted just long enough to be noticed, a beat of calculation before the performance began. "How wonderful." Her smile could have sold insurance. "Derek, we should talk about schools, and of course we'll want to schedule genetic counseling, just to be safe given the mixed background." Naomi felt Tristan's hand find hers under the table, a reassurance that came too late and withdrew too quickly. "We're fine, Mother. It's early days." Of course. I'm simply thinking ahead. A child changes everything. Your career trajectory, your social obligations. You'll need to be strategic." Vivian's gaze flickered to Naomi, then away. "And Naomi, dear, You'll want to be careful about weight gain. Some women let themselves go during pregnancy. You'll want to maintain standards. The affair likely began sometime in the second year. Though Naomi couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, Vanessa Hartford transformed from business consultant to something more. Vanessa appeared at family dinners with increasing frequency, always dressed in clothes that suggested both competence and availability, always directing her conversation toward Tristan while including the rest of the table just enough to maintain plausibility. Vivian had introduced her as someone who could help modernize Ashford logistics, bring fresh perspective to their regional operations. The company had been founded by Lawrence's father and ran on systems that predated digital record-keeping. Vanessa's expertise in supply chain optimization made her a natural fit, or so Vivian explained during the first dinner where she sat in what had become Naomi's chair. Naomi found herself relocated to a seat near the kitchen, close enough to help clear plates but far enough from the conversation to become functionally invisible. Tristan's phone began buzzing at odd hours. He started taking calls in the car, in the bathroom, anywhere Naomi couldn't overhear. His laptop stayed closed when she entered the room. He came home late 3 nights a week, then 4, eventually more nights than not, always with plausible explanations about client meetings and strategic planning sessions that couldn't wait until morning. At 6 months pregnant, moving through the house she shared with a man who increasingly felt like a stranger, Naomi opened her laptop to check her email and found a tab Tristan had left open, a text thread with Vanessa going back months. She scrolled through the messages with a hand on her swelling belly, reading evidence of an intimacy that had migrated from professional to personal to something that made her stomach twist. The messages contained no explicit confessions, no smoking gun that would hold up in divorce court. Just 1,000 small betrayals, inside jokes that excluded her, references to conversations she hadn't been part of, a tone of conspiracy that suggested Naomi existed as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a wife to be cherished. She confronted him that night when he finally came home at 11:30, tie loosened and smelling of wine he hadn't drunk with her. His face when she showed him the messages cycled through shock to something like relief, as if being caught meant he could finally stop pretending. "It's not what you think. What I think is that you're sleeping with your mother's business consultant while I'm carrying your child." "We haven't." He stopped, recalculated. "It's complicated. Explain it to me simply." He sat on the edge of their bed, head in his hands, and for a moment she saw the man who had saved her laptop from coffee, who had left notes in her pockets, who had promised her everything under Wisconsin stars. Then he looked up, and that man was gone. "Mother says you're not a good fit, that I need someone who understands the business, who can help me advance. She's been pushing Vanessa since the beginning, and I've been trying to resist, but what? But maybe she's right. Maybe I rushed into this. We barely knew each other, and now there's a baby coming, and I don't know if I'm ready for me." The words came out flat, all the fight draining out of her. "Or for a life your mother didn't approve in advance?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. A week later, a FedEx envelope arrived addressed to Naomi Brooks. Inside, a leather-bound journal and a note in Edward Pierce's precise handwriting. "From your father. Open only when you've lost everything." She hid it in the back of her closet, unwilling to admit she had reached that point. Not yet. Not while she still believed Tristan might choose her over his mother's approval. That 3 years of waiting might yield the authentic love her father had challenged her to find. Her 34th birthday arrived in September with no celebration, no acknowledgement beyond a perfunctory text from Tristan that arrived at noon and read like an obligation fulfilled. Carmen called from Sterling Holdings, the company Naomi technically owned but had never visited, had never claimed, maintaining the fiction that she was simply Naomi Brooks who worked occasional freelance data entry to make rent. "Happy birthday, boss." Carmen's voice carried affection and exasperation in equal measure. "When are you going to tell him?" "Tell him what?" "That you own his entire life. That every promotion, every success, every dollar his family has accumulated since you got married, it all traces back to your father's network. Edward's been executing the plan for 3 years. Elijah set it up before he died. Wanted to see if Tristan would love you when he thought you had nothing. Naomi pressed her forehead against the window of the small bedroom where she spent her days, watching autumn leaves drift past glass that needed cleaning. And the verdict? You already know the verdict. You've known for months, maybe longer. So when do we stop this experiment? Christmas. The word came out before she had fully decided. One more chance. He deserves one more chance. He deserves nothing, but you deserve to be certain, so Christmas it is. Carmen's tone softened. The trust activated this morning. You're officially worth $10.8 billion as of 12:01 a.m. Congratulations. You're one of the wealthiest women in America, married to a man who comes home smelling like another woman's perfume. After the call ended, Naomi sat in silence, hand on her belly where their daughter moved with increasing frequency, and thought about her father's words. Patience is the most expensive thing in this world to own. She had been patient for 3 years. She could manage 3 more months. December 20th arrived with the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned morning frost into sculptures of temporary beauty. Vivian had spent weeks planning the Christmas gala, sending invitations to 75 carefully selected guests, investors in Ashford Logistics, members of the country club who controlled the social architecture of their Connecticut suburb. People whose presence would remind everyone of the Ashford family's place in the community's hierarchy. Tristan left early that morning for a breakfast meeting Naomi suspected involved Vanessa, but no longer had the energy to question. She dressed in a Target maternity dress, burgundy, the only color that still fit and didn't make her look like she was drowning in fabric, and called Edward Pierce. "It's time." His response came without hesitation. "You're certain?" "I'm certain I've given him every opportunity to choose me. I'm certain his mother orchestrated tonight's event specifically to humiliate me in front of people whose opinions she values. I'm certain I don't want to raise my daughter in a house where love is conditional on meeting someone else's standards." She took a breath, felt her daughter kick against her ribs. "Execute Protocol Silverback. The convoy will be ready. 45 minutes after you call, we arrive. Standard formation?" "Standard formation." "Edward," she paused. "My father, did he know it would be this hard?" "He knew." The elderly lawyer's voice carried decades of friendship with a man who had understood human nature in all its complexity. "That's why he prepared for every possibility. That's why the plan exists. Your father loved you enough to let you try, and loved you enough to catch you when you fell. Now go to that gala, Naomi. Let them show you who they are one final time, and then we'll show them who you've always been." The Ashford estate glittered with lights that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, each window glowing with warmth that was entirely performative. Inside, 75 guests mingled in the formal dining room, drinking champagne that Vivian had selected personally, eating canapes prepared by a catering service from Manhattan, because local options weren't sophisticated enough. Naomi arrived to find herself seated at a table near the kitchen, close enough to be available if anyone needed anything, but far enough from the family table to signal her status. She recognized the strategy. Vivian's sophistication meant she would never create a scene, would never overtly exclude, would simply arrange the furniture of social interaction to communicate exactly where everyone belonged. Tristan sat at the head table with his mother, Vanessa to his right in a white dress that managed to suggest bridal aspirations without crossing into inappropriate territory. Lawrence occupied the seat to Vivian's left, Sloane beside him scrolling through her phone and occasionally snapping photos for her Instagram followers. Vivian rose when dinner concluded, champagne glass catching light as she called for attention. The conversations died in waves, silence spreading across the room until only the soft clink of silver on china remained. Everyone, thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the Ashford family and our continued success in the business community. Her smile swept the room, pausing on faces that mattered, skipping over those that didn't. Tristan has exciting news about a promotion that will take him to new heights. Tristan stood, uncomfortable but complicit, a man who had learned to follow his mother's scripts even when they required abandoning his own judgment. We're expanding operations to Connecticut, opening a regional office that will coordinate logistics along the eastern seaboard. It's a significant opportunity for growth. Vivian's hand settled on his shoulder, proprietary and proud. Of course, this expansion requires changes, strategic positioning, evolution. Her gaze found Naomi at the distant table, held just long enough to make everyone else follow it. Sometimes we outgrow our initial choices. Sometimes we realize we need partners who can match our ambitions rather than anchor them. The message landed like a stone in still water, ripples of understanding spreading through guests who suddenly found their wine fascinating or their napkins requiring immediate attention. Naomi felt 75 pairs of eyes trying not to look at her while simultaneously cataloging every detail of her reaction. Vivian crossed the room with the deliberate grace of someone staging a performance, stopping at Naomi's table with an expression of concern that wouldn't have convinced a particularly gullible child. "Naomi, dear," she sat without invitation. "That ring looks terribly tight with the swelling. Why don't you let me hold it for you, just for safekeeping?" The ring, $800 purchased on a payment plan, the physical symbol of promises made under Wisconsin stars, sat on Naomi's finger where it had lived for 3 years. Removing it would mean conceding, accepting Vivian's judgment that she didn't belong, would never belong, could never belong. "I'm fine, thank you." "I insist." Vivian's hand shot out, fingers closing around Naomi's wrist with surprising strength. "You're making a scene." 75 witnesses watched as Vivian Ashford slid the ring from her daughter-in-law's finger, pocketing it with the casual dismissal of someone discarding trash. No one intervened. No one looked away either, the kind of collective witnessing that would be discussed later in hushed tones, the story refined through retelling until it became mythology. Vivian returned to her position beside Tristan, one hand still holding the champagne glass, the other now containing Naomi's wedding ring. She raised her voice just enough to carry. "And I'm thrilled to announce that Vanessa Hartford will be joining Tristan in Connecticut as his executive assistant. They'll be working very closely on this expansion, very closely indeed." Vanessa smiled from the head table, a curve of lips that suggested she had won something worth having. Tristan wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, least of all his wife's. Naomi pushed back from her table, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the strained silence. At 6 months pregnant, standing required effort that made her momentarily unsteady. She placed one hand on her belly, the other on the table's edge for balance. Vivian's voice followed her, pitched for performance. "Oh dear, are you leaving? But we haven't even served dessert." A calculated pause. "Though perhaps that's for the best. You do look tired. These events can be so overwhelming for people not accustomed to this level of—" She stopped herself, but the implication completed itself in the silence. For people not accustomed to civilized company. For people who didn't belong. For people like you. Lawrence Ashford cleared his throat, the sound of a man who had decided his wife's performance had crossed some invisible line but lacked the conviction to stop it. "Naomi, perhaps you should get some rest. We can have someone drive you home." "That won't be necessary." Naomi's voice came out steady, surprising herself. "I'll manage." She walked toward the coat closet, each step requiring conscious effort not to rush, not to flee, to maintain the dignity her mother had told her was free, available to anyone who chose to claim it regardless of circumstance. Behind her, conversations resumed in careful tones, people discussing the weather and business and anything except what they had just witnessed. Vivian appeared at her side as she reached for her coat, moving with the predatory speed of someone sensing final victory. "Before you go, Her voice dropped to a whisper meant only for Naomi. "This is what happens when you pick up strays, Derek. They don't know how to behave in civilized company. One can't teach breeding, you understand. It's either there or it isn't." The wine glass tilted just slightly, just enough. Red wine arced through the air, splashing across Naomi's burgundy dress with the precision of someone who had planned the trajectory. Vivian's expression cycled through shock to concern to apology in rapid succession, a performance worthy of community theater. "Oh my goodness, how clumsy of me! Maria!" she called toward the kitchen. "Bring towels immediately!" The housekeeper appeared, witnessed the scene, started toward them before Vivian's glare stopped her mid-step. "Actually, Maria, the dishes need attention. Naomi can manage a simple spill." 75 people watched a pregnant woman stand in a spreading wine stain while the hostess who had caused it expressed empty concern and prevented anyone from helping. The performance had reached its crescendo. Lawrence stepped forward, the patriarch summoned to deliver the final line. "Naomi, I think it would be best if you left now. You're disrupting our guests." She looked at Tristan one last time, a man she had loved who had become someone she didn't recognize, who stood beside his mother and said nothing, did nothing, chose nothing except the path of least resistance. His jaw worked like he might speak, might finally choose his wife over his mother's approval. Then the moment passed. "Just go, Naomi." His voice barely carried across the distance between them. "We'll talk tomorrow." Security, hired specifically for the gala, men who didn't know her and therefore felt no obligation to question their orders, appeared on either side of her. Not touching, not forcing, simply present as a reminder that her presence was no longer desired. She walked between them through the door into December air that bit through the wine-soaked dress with immediate cruelty. Her heel caught on the front steps, the cheap shoe twisting under her weight. She felt the strap snap, the sudden instability sending her stumbling against the stone railing. The security guards paused at the door, their job complete. Behind them, the gala continued, conversations and laughter and the clink of champagne glasses celebrating the Ashford family's continued success. The door closed, a sound of finality. Naomi stood on the steps, 6 months pregnant, in a ruined dress, holding a broken heel in her hand, and feeling snow begin to fall in that half-hearted way that suggested more would follow. She removed the other shoe, threw both into the bushes, and continued barefoot down the driveway toward the street. The cold bit immediately, shocking against the soles of her feet, but walking was easier without the heel's unsteady height. She made it to the gate before the full reality of her situation crystallized. No phone, left in the coat check she had never reached. No money, no shoes. Pregnant, wine-stained, and standing in snow that was beginning to accumulate with the kind of determination that suggested the weather had decided to match her evening. A delivery truck rolled up to the gate, headlights cutting through the increasing snowfall. The driver, a black man in his 50s with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize crisis when it appeared, climbed out of the cab. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The question broke something in her, the dam she had been maintaining through sheer force of will. She wasn't all right. She was the furthest thing from all right. She was standing barefoot in the snow while her husband's family celebrated their success in removing the obstacle she represented to their vision of his future. "Do you have a phone I could borrow?" Clinton Davis, the name she would learn later after everything changed, studied her for a moment, taking in the pregnancy, the ruined dress, the bare feet. Then he opened his truck's passenger door. "Get in before you freeze." The heater blasted warm air that stung her frozen skin. Clinton handed her his jacket without being asked. Heavy canvas lined with fleece that smelled like diesel and honest work. Then he passed her his phone. She dialed Edward Pierce's number from memory. "It's time." The convoy arrived exactly 45 minutes later. 6 black Escalades and 1 Rolls-Royce Phantom that looked like it had been carved from midnight itself. The trucks maintained perfect formation, headlights cutting through snow that had transformed from tentative flurries into a determined assault on visibility. Edward Pierce emerged from the lead Escalade in a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than Clinton made in a month, flanked by 4 men in black whose bearing suggested military backgrounds and current employment in private security. The Rolls-Royce's rear door opened and Naomi stepped out transformed. She had changed in the car during the drive. The wine-stained Target dress replaced by a black cashmere coat that whispered luxury through every thread. Her hair, previously loose and snow-dampened, had been pulled into a sleek arrangement that suggested controlled power. The only jewelry she wore was her mother's simple silver necklace, visible at her throat like a reminder of where she had come from and what she carried forward. She walked toward the Ashford estate barefoot, the broken heels dangling from one hand, 4 security personnel flanking her at precise intervals. Snow continued to fall, catching in her hair, melting against the cashmere, creating an image that looked less like a woman arriving at a party and more like judgment approaching in human form. The 75 guests who had watched her departure now witnessed her return. Faces appearing at windows, conversations dying as the motorcade's significance registered. This wasn't a woman returning to plead or apologize. This was something else entirely. Something that made the security guards at the door step aside without waiting for instructions. Vivian met her in the foyer, the smile on her face flickering between confusion and the first hints of genuine concern. "Naomi, what on earth is this theater? Did you hire actors to intimidate us?" "Really, this is..." Edward Pierce stepped forward, his presence alone sufficient to stop Vivian mid-sentence. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm Edward Pierce of Pierce & Associates. I represent the Sterling estate." "Sterling?" Vivian's confidence wavered for the first time all evening. "Her last name is Brooks. She's been lying about..." "Her name is Naomi Sterling, daughter of Elijah Sterling, founder of Sterling Holdings. She is the sole heir to an estate currently valued at $10.8 billion. The number hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Lawrence's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against marble flooring with a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics suggested possible. Tristan's face cycled through disbelief to horror, to a kind of sick realization that was almost worse than ignorance. 75 witnesses stood frozen, their evening of celebration transforming into something that would be discussed in whispers for years. The night the Ashford family learned what it meant to miscalculate so completely. The study where Edward Pierce escorted the Ashford family felt smaller than its actual dimensions suggested, walls pressing inward with the weight of revelation. Lawrence lowered himself into a leather chair that had belonged to his father, the furniture suddenly feeling like borrowed property. Vivian remained standing, spine rigid, as if sitting would constitute acceptance of circumstances she refused to acknowledge. Tristan paced near the window, his reflection in the glass showing a man watching his entire understanding of reality dissolve like sugar in water. Sloane had abandoned her phone for once, staring at Naomi with an expression that cycled between fascination and something approaching fear. Naomi settled into a wingback chair with the careful movements of late pregnancy, Edward standing to her right, the 4 security personnel positioned at strategic points around the room. The contrast was deliberate. She sat while they stood, comfortable while they struggled, centered while their world tilted on an axis they hadn't known existed. Before Edward could begin his systematic dismantling, Naomi raised one hand. "Bring Clinton Davis inside, the delivery driver who helped me." Tristan's mouth opened, closed, confusion rendering him temporarily speechless. "What does a delivery driver have to do with everything?" Her voice carried a certainty that brooked no argument. "He showed me kindness when 75 people watched your mother throw me out. When you stood silent. When everyone in that dining room chose convenience over conscience. Bring him in." One of the security personnel left, returning moments later with Clinton, who entered the study with the wariness of someone who understood that rooms like this rarely meant good news for people like him. His canvas jacket looked shabby against the mahogany paneling, his work boots tracking melting snow onto Persian rugs worth more than his annual salary. Naomi gestured to the chair beside her. "Please sit, Mr. Davis." Clinton sat, hands clasped between his knees, looking like he wanted to disappear into the expensive upholstery. "Edward, what's in the immediate discretionary fund?" The lawyer consulted his tablet with the ease of someone who had anticipated this exact question. 22 million, liquid and accessible within the hour. Transfer 100,000 to Mr. Davis tonight and put him on payroll as Director of Community Outreach for Sterling Foundation. Annual salary 180,000, full benefits starting immediately. Clinton's hands went still. "Ma'am, I can't possibly do. You showed me humanity when it cost you nothing and gained you nothing. That's worth more than anything in this room." She turned to face Tristan, her gaze steady and unforgiving. "This is what character looks like. This is what it means to see another human being and choose kindness instead of calculation." The message landed like a physical blow. Tristan's face drained of color, one hand bracing against the windowsill for support. Edward opened a leather portfolio, the sound of papers rustling filling the silence that followed. "Shall we begin with the house?" He produced a deed, sliding it across the coffee table toward Lawrence. The older man picked it up with trembling fingers, his eyes tracking across the legal language before stopping on the ownership line. His lips moved soundlessly, reading the words twice as if repetition might change their meaning. 412 Maple Ridge Drive. This property was purchased 4 years ago by the Sterling Family Trust for $2.3 million. You've been living here under a lease agreement that charges $1 per year. Market rental value for a property of this size and location runs approximately $18,500 per month. Over 4 years, you've saved approximately $666,000 in housing costs. Lawrence's hand holding the deed began to shake, the paper rustling with the tremor. "That's impossible. My father left me this house in his will. I have the probate documents. Your father's will left you $40,000 and the contents of his personal storage unit. The house came from what the probate court listed as an anonymous benefactor. That benefactor was Elijah Sterling, acting through a series of shell companies specifically designed to conceal the source." Vivian snatched the deed from her husband's hands, her eyes scanning the document with the desperate speed of someone searching for an escape clause in a contract that offered none. "This is fabricated. You can't just claim—" "The deed is recorded with the county clerk's office. Public record. Feel free to verify it yourself. In fact—" Edward produced his phone, pulled up a website, turned the screen toward her. "Here's the digital record. You can see the filing date, the transfer of ownership, the trust structure that holds title." The screen's glow reflected off Vivian's face, highlighting the fine lines around her eyes that expensive cosmetics usually obscured. She set the deed down with exaggerated care, as if it might detonate. "Even if this is true, it doesn't change anything. We've maintained this property, improved it, paid taxes. The property taxes have been paid through an escrow account funded by Sterling Holdings since the purchase date. Every payment, every assessment, every municipal fee, the landscaping service you use, contracted through a Sterling subsidiary. The renovation you commissioned 2 years ago on the West Wing, financed through a home equity line of credit secured by Sterling guarantees." Edward's delivery remained professionally neutral, a surgeon cataloging damage without judgment. "You've spent considerable money maintaining a property you never owned, believing you were investing in your inheritance. You were actually improving someone else's asset." Tristan had stopped pacing, frozen near the window, his reflection overlaying the snow-covered grounds like a ghost witnessing its own funeral. "The business. Tell me the business is real." Edward flipped to a new section in his portfolio, the gesture almost apologetic. "Ashford Logistics, founded by your grandfather, Lawrence Ashford Sr. in 1987. Initial capital came from a $200,000 loan from Heartland Capital Group. Heartland Capital. Lawrence latched onto the name like a drowning man finding driftwood. That was a standard commercial lender. I have the original loan documents. Heartland Capital Group is a wholly owned subsidiary of Sterling Holdings. Has been since 1985. Every commercial lender that's ever extended credit to Ashford Logistics, every major client contract, every favorable insurance rate, all of it traces back through shell companies, strategic partnerships, and carefully structured relationships to Sterling Holdings. The words settled over the room like fallout, invisible but contaminating everything they touched. Tristan's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. How many of our successes were real? Edward consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis. Your coffee shop job during business school. That was authentic employment based on merit. Everything after, your acceptance into the executive training program, your first promotion to coordinator, your advancement to associate director, your appointment as vice president. Each of these milestones occurred shortly after Sterling Holdings initiated or deepened business relationships with Ashford Logistics. I earned those positions. I worked 80-hour weeks, closed difficult accounts. The accounts you closed were already softened by preliminary negotiations conducted by Sterling intermediaries. The clients you impressed had been briefed by Sterling associates about the importance of maintaining positive relationships with Ashford Logistics personnel. Your 80-hour weeks were real, your effort was genuine, but the outcomes were predetermined. Tristan turned from the window, his face carrying the expression of someone watching their autobiography revealed as fiction. 3 years, I had 3 years. Naomi spoke for the first time since Clinton's appointment, her voice carrying a sadness that somehow cut deeper than anger. You had 3 years to love me when you thought I was nobody, when you believed I was a waitress who did freelance data entry to cover rent, when my worth couldn't be measured in connections or advantages or doors I might open. She shifted in the chair, one hand unconsciously moving to cradle her belly. Your mother was right about one thing. I was a test, just not the kind she imagined. Vivian found her voice, though it emerged hoarse and uncertain. You lied to us. You came into our home under false pretenses, deceived my son. I came into your home as myself, Naomi. A woman who loved your son. The lie was in what I didn't say, not what I did. And every day I waited for Tristan to ask questions about my family, my background, where I came from. He never did. Not once in 3 years. The accusation hung between them, undeniable because it was true. Tristan's face confirmed it, memory clearly cycling through countless conversations where he had discussed his family's history, his business challenges, his mother's expectations, without ever demonstrating reciprocal curiosity about the woman he had married. Edward produced another document, this one significantly thicker. Your promotion to vice president came with a salary increase from $85,000 to $210,000 annually. The bump was explained as recognition of your strategic value to the company. In reality, it was funded through a performance bonus structure tied to contracts with 3 subsidiary companies: Meridian Freight Solutions, Coastal Logistics Partners, and Northeast Distribution Network. All 3 are Sterling Holdings shell companies created specifically to funnel money into Ashford Logistics without revealing the source. Jesus Christ! Lawrence's voice broke on the words. How deep does this go? Comprehensive. Edward turned pages, each one representing another layer of the architecture Elijah Sterling had constructed. Your country club membership, Mrs. Ashford, sponsored by Helen Worthington, who you believed accepted you based on your social graces and charitable work. Mrs. Worthington serves on the Sterling Foundation Advisory Board. Your sponsorship was the result of a phone call from Elijah Sterling approximately 6 months before Naomi and Tristan married. Vivian's hand rose to her throat, fingers finding the pearl necklace she had worn as a symbol of her arrival into respectable society. Helen Worthington barely spoke to me before that call. After the call, she became your advocate, smoothed your entry into social circles that had previously remained cleared, facilitated introductions, arranged committee appointments, positioned you as someone worthy of attention. Edward's tone remained clinically neutral. Elijah Sterling made one call per year on your behalf. Just enough to open doors, never enough to make the assistance obvious. He wanted to see how you would treat his daughter when you believed she was beneath you. The implications spread like cracks in ice, each revelation branching into new understandings of how thoroughly their lives had been shaped by forces they had never detected. Sloane finally spoke, her voice smaller than anyone in the room had ever heard it. My influencer contracts, the brand partnerships that started 2 years ago. 4 of your sponsors, Radiant Cosmetics, Urban Threads Apparel, Pacific Wellness, and Lux Accessories, are owned by Sterling portfolio companies. Your engagement rates and follower counts merited attention, but the contracts and payment terms were significantly more generous than market standards, specifically because of your family connection to Naomi. Sloane's phone slipped from her hands, clattering against the hardwood floor with a sound like something breaking that couldn't be repaired. The cars. Tristan's voice emerged hollow, a man performing an inventory of his own irrelevance. My Audi, Mother's Mercedes. Both leased through Ashford Logistics under a fleet management program that receives substantial discounts from the dealership. The dealership is partially owned by a Sterling investment fund. Your lease terms are approximately 40% below market rate. Edward flipped to another section. Your family vacations over the past 3 years. The villa in Tuscany, the ski resort in Aspen, the beach house in the Hamptons. All booked through a corporate travel program that Ashford Logistics gained access to after Sterling Holdings acquired a controlling interest in the travel management company. Lawrence stood abruptly, the chair scraping backward with a sound like something fleeing. Why? If your father was so goddamn powerful, why did he waste his time on us? What could he possibly gain from He gained the answer to a question. Naomi's voice cut through his rising panic with the precision of a scalpel. Would you love me when I had nothing? Would your son choose me over your approval? Would your family treat me with basic human dignity when you believed I was nobody worth knowing? She paused, letting the silence emphasize what came next. You failed, spectacularly, completely, in every way that mattered. Vivian's facade finally cracked. Years of carefully maintained composure shattering under the weight of implications she could no longer deny. You manipulated us, set us up to fail. What kind of person does that? The kind who spent 40 years clawing his way up from a janitor's wages to build an empire, who wanted his daughter to find someone real before the money made that impossible. Naomi's eyes held no sympathy, no regret. My father gave you every advantage, made you prosperous beyond your capabilities, and all he asked in return was that you treat me like a human being. You couldn't manage even that. The study door opened, one of the security personnel entering with a woman whose crisp professional attire suggested legal expertise. She carried a briefcase that clicked open with the sound of business being conducted. Mrs. Sterling, the documents are prepared. Edward accepted a folder, spreading its contents across the coffee table like cards in a game where the outcome had already been determined. Dissolution of marriage. Tristan, you'll find the terms clearly outlined. Full custody of the child to Naomi. You'll have supervised visitation rights contingent on maintaining sobriety and stable employment. Child support calculated at $1,200 monthly, indexed to inflation and reviewable annually. Tristan's knees buckled, catching himself against the windowsill. $1,200? I can't survive on what's left after. You'll survive on what you can actually earn. All Sterling subsidies to Ashford Logistics terminate effective midnight tonight. Every contract with Sterling subsidiaries will be canceled with standard 30-day notice as outlined in the termination clauses. Your salary and position were predicated on business that will no longer exist. Edward produced another document. Your current annual salary is $210,000. Market value for your actual skills and experience based on comparable positions at genuinely independent firms ranges from 42 to 58,000. The numbers hit like a physical assault. Lawrence made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, the noise of a man watching his legacy revealed as borrowed property he had mistaken for inheritance. The house. Vivian's voice barely qualified as sound. You can't just take the house. We have rights. We've lived here for... You have 7 days to vacate. The property will be converted into the Grace House Community Center, named for my daughter. It will serve as transitional housing and support services for single mothers regardless of race, background, or circumstance. Naomi's delivery remained calm, each word placed with the care of someone who had thought through every detail. Every woman who walks through those doors will know she's good enough exactly as she is. That her worth isn't determined by her bank account or her family tree or whether she meets someone else's standards of acceptability. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. The house where Naomi had been made to feel inferior would become a sanctuary for women society had similarly dismissed. The rooms where Vivian had orchestrated humiliation would host programs designed to affirm dignity. The dining room where Naomi had sat at the end of the table would serve meals to people who understood what it meant to be invisible. You're destroying us. Lawrence's voice carried the weight of a man watching everything he had built revealed as sandcastle architecture. Taking everything, leaving us with nothing. I'm removing what was never yours and revealing what you actually built through your own effort. If that equals nothing, perhaps you should consider what that says about your capabilities. Naomi shifted in the chair, discomfort flickering across her face before being suppressed. But I'm not cruel, and I'm not vindictive, despite what you believe about people like me. Edward produced another set of documents. Mr. Ashford, regarding the pension fund discrepancies. The SEC investigation will move forward, but Sterling Holdings has already reimbursed every affected employee with interest from Naomi's personal accounts. Your cooperation with federal investigators will be noted in our recommendation for leniency. You'll likely receive probation rather than incarceration. Lawrence's face showed the complex mathematics of a man calculating whether probation represented mercy or simply a slower form of destruction. And my ability to work in corporate management? Forfeit. The settlement agreement includes permanent prohibition from serving in any fiduciary capacity. You can work, but never again in a position of financial trust. The older man nodded, the gesture of someone accepting a sentence that could have been worse but remained punishing nonetheless. Vivian reached for her husband's hand, their fingers intertwining with the desperation of people who had discovered they were each other's only remaining ally. And me? Tristan's question emerged barely louder than breathing. What happens to me? You live with the consequences of your choices. Naomi's words carried a finality that precluded argument. You'll sign a statement acknowledging your knowledge of the pension fund irregularities and your failure to report them. You won't face criminal charges, but your professional reputation will reflect the truth. You'll find work, but never again at the level you believed you had earned. I did earn it. You worked within a system rigged in your favor by my father. Now you'll work within a system that treats you exactly as it treats everyone else, no better, no worse. You'll discover what it's like when success requires actual merit instead of invisible assistance. She paused, something that might have been sadness crossing her features. I spent 3 years loving you, Tristan, trying to believe that the man who saved my laptop in a coffee shop still existed somewhere beneath your mother's expectations. But you chose. Every day you chose. And now you get to live with those choices. 3 days after the confrontation in the Ashford study, Naomi sat in the penthouse apartment that had belonged to her father, 90 stories above Manhattan, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views that reduced the city to a glittering circuit board of human ambition. Carmen Ortiz occupied the adjacent chair, her tablet displaying the controlled chaos of Sterling Holdings' daily operations. The phone call came at 2:15 in the afternoon. Edward's number appearing on the screen with the kind of timing that suggested he had been waiting for the precise right moment. Vanessa Hartford contacted my office this morning. She has something she wants to sell. Naomi's hand stilled on the teacup she had been raising. I'm listening. Tristan's laptop. 3 years of emails, text messages, browser history. She's offering comprehensive documentation of his affair, his contempt for you, his complicity in his mother's behavior. She wants $75,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. Carmen looked up from her tablet, eyebrows rising. The calculation was obvious. Vanessa Hartford had assessed the situation, determined that Ashford Logistics was sinking, and decided to salvage what she could before the wreckage pulled her down. She's offering to betray the man she was sleeping with for the price of a luxury car. Essentially, yes, though I suspect her motivation is more complex than simple greed. The Hartford family has financial entanglements with Ashford Logistics that will be exposed when your subsidies terminate. She's trying to build goodwill before the investigations begin. Naomi set the teacup down, staring out at the city below, where millions of people navigated their own versions of betrayal and calculation. Pay her, but I want everything. Every message, every email, every shred of documentation. And Edward, the NDA protects us, not her. If she breathes a word of this transaction to anyone, the agreement voids and we release everything she's given us. The laptop arrived via courier 6 hours later, delivered to Edward's office in a nondescript box that looked like it might contain office supplies. Carmen brought it to the penthouse that evening, setting it on the dining table like evidence in a trial that hadn't yet commenced. Naomi opened it with the kind of reluctance that accompanies knowledge you can't unknow, clicking through folders that documented the slow erosion of her marriage in digital fragments. The emails stretched back 22 months, beginning professional and gradually shifting into something intimate, then conspiratorial, finally contemptuous. One message, dated 6 months into Naomi's pregnancy, made her stomach clench. She actually thinks I work late because of client meetings. I could rob a bank in front of her and she'd apologize for being in the way. Mother's right, she's too simple to understand what's happening until it's too late. Another from 3 weeks before the Christmas gala. V says the party will solve everything, publicly establish who belongs in the family and who doesn't. I just need to stay quiet and let Mother handle it. She's better at this than I am. The messages painted a portrait of a man who had outsourced his moral decision-making to his mother while maintaining enough distance to preserve deniability. Not actively cruel, but passively complicit. Not overtly betraying his wife, but allowing others to betray her on his behalf while he stood silent. Carmen watched Naomi read, her expression cycling through anger to disgust to something approaching pity. You want me to add this to the SEC filing? It's not directly relevant to the pension fraud, but it establishes character and pattern of behavior. All of it. Naomi closed the laptop, unable to continue cataloging the death of something she had wanted to believe in. Lawrence diverted money from retirement accounts. Tristan diverted his integrity. Both are theft. Both deserve documentation. Following Wednesday, 2 weeks after the Christmas gala that had transformed 75 witnesses into unwitting participants in a revelation they would discuss for years, the New York Chronicle published a story that detonated across social media with the force of something people had been waiting for without knowing it. The headline occupied 3 lines of bold text. The sterling deception. Billionaire heiress married average executive as social experiment, then destroyed his family when he left her. The article opened with a photo of Naomi from the Christmas gala, her pregnant silhouette visible against the Ashford mansion's lights, the image carefully cropped to remove context. The text that followed painted her as a vindictive billionaire who had infiltrated a middle-class family, deceived a man who genuinely loved her, then deployed her fortune to obliterate them when the marriage failed. Carmen threw her tablet across the conference room when she finished reading. the device skidding across polished wood and coming to rest against the far wall. Brett Sullivan, junior analyst we passed over for promotion 3 months ago. He leaked everything to the Chronicle. How much did they pay him? Sources indicate $75,000, same amount we paid Vanessa. Someone's being poetic about pricing betrayal. Carmen retrieved her tablet, checking for damage. There's more. The article includes quotes from close friends of the family describing you as cold, calculating, deliberately targeting Tristan because his family represented the kind of acceptance you craved but couldn't earn legitimately. Within 6 hours, the hashtag Sterling Deception was trending nationally. Twitter filled with takes ranging from sympathetic to savage, everyone suddenly an expert on the ethics of testing people's character by hiding your wealth. Think pieces proliferated like bacteria in a petri dish, each one claiming definitive insight into Naomi's motivations, her father's legacy, her right to privacy versus the public's right to transparency. By evening, the story had migrated from social media to cable news, panels of pundits discussing whether Naomi was a victim protecting herself or a villain weaponizing her privilege. The consensus tilted toward villain, the narrative easier to process when it positioned the billionaire as the aggressor and the discarded husband as the wounded party. Tristan appeared on a morning show 72 hours after the Chronicle article dropped, his hair freshly cut, wearing a suit that looked borrowed but fit well enough to pass casual inspection. The host, a woman whose career depended on eliciting emotional responses from guests, leaned forward with practiced sympathy. Tell us what it was like discovering the woman you loved had been lying about who she was. Tristan's voice emerged with precisely calibrated vulnerability, hurt without being pathetic, wounded without seeming weak. I loved her. When we met, I thought I'd found someone real, someone who didn't care about money or status or any of the things that usually matter in my family's circles. We had this simplicity together. Coffee shop dates, hiking, just being normal people. And you had no idea she was a billionaire? None. She told me her parents were dead, that she was alone in the world working these freelance jobs to make rent. I wanted to take care of her. I proposed with a ring I bought on a payment plan because I wanted to give her something meaningful even though I didn't have much. His voice cracked just enough to sound genuine. Now I know she was probably laughing at me the whole time, at how naive I was, how easy to manipulate. The host's expression radiated sympathy. And when you discovered the truth, she destroyed us, used her billions to take everything my family had built. My father's facing federal charges. My mother lost her social standing. I lost my job, my home, my future, all because I wasn't rich enough for her. All because she wanted revenge for... He stopped, the pause heavy with implication. I don't even know what I did wrong. I loved her, I was faithful. The lie landed smoothly, his face showing none of the tells that usually accompanied false statements. The audience murmured sympathetically, the sound of people who had decided on the narrative and welcomed confirmation. Naomi watched the broadcast from her penthouse, Carmen beside her on the sofa, both of them silent as Tristan rewrote history in real time. The man on screen bore little resemblance to the one who had stood in the Ashford study 3 weeks earlier, who had acknowledged his affair through silence when confronted with Vanessa's laptop. When the segment ended, Carmen muted the television. He's good at this. Better than I expected. The comments are 80% in his favor. Because the story he's telling is simpler than the truth. Billionaire manipulates innocent man is easier to process than man fails character test his wife's father designed. Naomi stood, moving to the window where Manhattan sprawled below. What about the leak? Brett Sullivan? He broke his NDA, but the Chronicle has resources to fight that lawsuit for years, and even if we win, the damage is done. He gave them enough documentation to make the story credible. Dates, details about Sterling Holdings' structure, information about your father's will. Hartford money funded this. Has to be. The timing, The amount they paid Brett, the focus on making me the villain. Vanessa's parents are trying to muddy the investigation waters before we expose their tax evasion schemes. Carmen nodded, already typing on her tablet. I'll have our forensic accounting team prioritize the Hartford connections. If they paid Brett, there'll be a trail. The next move came from Sterling Holdings' communications department, a video statement recorded in Naomi's office with Manhattan visible through the windows behind her. She wore a simple navy dress, her pregnancy visible but not emphasized. Her mother's silver necklace, the only jewelry. The statement was brief, free of defensive posturing or emotional appeals. I hid my identity because I wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I own. That's not a crime, that's hope. My ex-husband is entitled to his pain, but not to rewrite history. I will let the facts speak for themselves. Then she announced the Elijah Sterling Scholarship Fund, $50 million dedicated to financial literacy education for women, with particular focus on single mothers re-entering the workforce. The announcement included her donation of Sterling Holdings stock in real time, the market value dropping $180 million as she transferred shares to the foundation without hesitation. The video went viral within 12 hours, not because it was dramatic or particularly emotional, but because watching someone give away the equivalent of a small nation's GDP without flinching carried its own kind of power. The hashtag I am Naomi began trending alongside hashtag Sterling Deception. Women sharing stories of being underestimated, dismissed, measured by their bank accounts rather than their character. The narrative shifted gradually, then suddenly, the way public opinion moves when enough people simultaneously realize the story they've been told doesn't quite fit the facts they can observe. Journalists began requesting interviews with the 75 witnesses from the Christmas gala, reconstructing what had actually happened versus what Tristan's morning show appearance had implied. But the damage had already metastasized in ways that public opinion couldn't reverse. On day 47 after the Christmas gala, the Sterling Holdings Board of Directors called an emergency meeting. Naomi sat at the head of the table, the same position her father had occupied for 40 years, while 10 board members arranged themselves along either side. Their faces carried the careful neutrality of people about to deliver news they knew would be unwelcome. Douglas Perry, the board member with undisclosed Hartford family consulting contracts that Naomi's team had recently uncovered, cleared his throat. We need to discuss the ongoing public controversy and its impact on shareholder value. The stock recovered 90% of the dip from my scholarship announcement within 3 days. Shareholders are fine. It's not about the stock price, it's about stability, confidence, the ability to conduct business without every transaction being scrutinized through the lens of your personal drama. Perry leaned back, the gesture of someone who believed he held the stronger position. The board has voted to place you on a 90-day cooling-off period while we assess the situation. The words settled over the conference room like snow, cold and suffocating. Carmen half rose from her seat at the opposite end of the table, fury making her voice sharp. You're benching her? The majority shareholder? The woman who literally owns this company? There's a clause in the corporate charter implemented by Elijah Sterling himself. It allows the board to impose a temporary leave of absence for any executive who becomes the subject of sustained public controversy that creates material risk to the company's operations. Perry produced a document, sliding it across the table. Your father wrote this clause, Naomi. He created it to protect Sterling Holdings from exactly this kind of situation. Irony had rarely been so cruel. Elijah Sterling had built safeguards to prevent personal scandal from damaging the company he had spent 40 years creating, never imagining those safeguards would be deployed against his own daughter by board members secretly allied with the family attempting to avoid investigation. The vote was 6-4, the majority sufficient under the charter's provisions. Naomi read the numbers in the faces around the table, which board members had been compromised, Which ones genuinely believed they were protecting the company, which ones simply lacked the courage to oppose what they saw as inevitable. Her keycard deactivated at 5 o'clock that evening, the magnetic strip rendered useless by electronic command. Her corporate email froze mid-sentence, cursor blinking on a message that would never be sent. Access to servers, files, systems, everything she had built and inherited simultaneously disappeared like a light switching off. She rode the elevator down 90 floors, the descent taking exactly 98 seconds, enough time for her reflection in the polished doors to show a woman who had lost access to her own empire because her father had been too thorough in protecting it. The lobby was full of employees who didn't know whether to acknowledge her departure or pretend they hadn't noticed. Uncomfortable silence spreading as she crossed marble floors toward the revolving doors. Outside, March rain fell with the kind of persistence that suggested it would continue for days, washing away the last remnants of winter while failing to deliver the warmth of spring. Naomi stood under the building's overhang, hand on her belly where Grace moved with increasing frequency, and considered the mathematics of patience that had defined her father's life and now defined her own. 4 days passed in her penthouse, 90 stories above a city that continued its business without requiring her participation. Carmen visited with soup that went uneaten. Edward arrived with legal briefs exploring options to challenge the board's decision, documents that remained unread. The penthouse felt less like a home and more like a very expensive waiting room, all glass and steel and views that suddenly seemed like exhibits in a museum rather than windows to a world she could affect. On the morning of the 5th day, Naomi woke at 4 a.m. Not from discomfort or anxiety, but from clarity. She made coffee in the kitchen that had every expensive appliance but rarely saw use, watching the sky lighten over Manhattan from black to gray to something approaching illumination. Her father had spent 40 years building Sterling Holdings through patience that most people couldn't afford to own. He had waded through setbacks, through failures, through moments when the entire enterprise threatened to collapse. And he had taught her that patience wasn't passive. It was the most aggressive form of strategy available to people willing to deploy it. She opened her personal laptop, not the corporate device that had been remotely wiped, but her own machine that contained contacts accumulated over 15 years of quiet relationship building. The list read like a directory of institutional power: pension fund managers who controlled billions, sovereign wealth fund directors who moved markets with single decisions, university endowments whose long-term thinking aligned with her own. The first call went to a managing director in Abu Dhabi whose fund held 3% of Sterling Holdings' outstanding shares. She didn't plead or explain or ask for sympathy. She presented quarterly earnings, pipeline projections, the clean energy initiative that was generating returns ahead of schedule. Pure data, no emotion, just the facts of Sterling Holdings' performance under her leadership. The second call reached a pension fund administrator in Sacramento whose retirement accounts held 2% of the company. Same approach: numbers, projections, evidence of competent management regardless of personal controversy. By noon, she had spoken to 11 investors representing 34% of Sterling Holdings' total shares. By evening, every one of them had placed calls to board members with identical messages. Reinstate Naomi Sterling or we initiate withdrawal procedures for our entire holdings. The board reconvened in emergency session 6 days later. The vote to reverse the cooling-off period was 9-1, with Douglas Perry casting the sole dissenting vote before submitting his resignation. Investigation into his Hartford family connections would later reveal consulting fees that violated his fiduciary duties, but that would come later, after Naomi had already won. She returned to Sterling Tower on day 53 wearing a white Givenchy suit that cost more than Tristan currently made in 6 months. The suit was deliberate, white for new beginnings, impeccably tailored to accommodate her pregnancy, expensive enough to remind everyone exactly who owned the building they occupied. 400 employees stood when she entered the lobby, applause building from scattered individuals into a wave that echoed off marble walls and glass ceilings. The sound carried something beyond professional courtesy. Relief that the stability they depended on had returned, validation that choosing competence over controversy was possible, hope that talent might occasionally triumph over optics. Naomi walked to the security desk where John had worked for 12 years, since before she had inherited the company. "Morning, John." His grin could have powered the building. "Welcome home, Miss Sterling. Conference room A in 10 minutes. Tell the acquisition team we're going shopping." She turned back to face the assembled employees, allowed herself a small smile. "And John, make sure the coffee is excellent. We have work to do." The boardroom 91 floors up felt different than it had 7 weeks earlier. The same furniture and windows and marble tables somehow transformed by knowledge of what they had nearly lost. The full executive team assembled with the nervous energy of people who had gambled on her return and won. Their positions now secure specifically because they had chosen correctly when the outcome remained uncertain. Naomi opened her laptop, the screen displaying an email she had prepared but not yet sent. The recipient line contained a single address, the Ashford family's attorney. "Send them a meeting request for next Thursday, 2 p.m., conference room A. Subject line, final settlement terms." She looked around the table at the people who had built Sterling Holdings alongside her father and now worked to preserve his legacy. "And make sure they know the CEO will attend." The message was clear to everyone in the room. Not Edward Pierce representing her interests, not lawyers negotiating on her behalf. Naomi herself in person exercising the power that the board had tried to suspend and the investors had fought to restore. The email arrived at the Ashford family's legal counsel on a Tuesday morning. The subject line containing just 4 words that carried the weight of finality. "Meeting request, Thursday 2 p.m. The body expanded only slightly. "Conference room A, Sterling Tower. The CEO will attend." Lawrence read the message 3 times in the studio apartment he now shared with his son, the space containing 2 bedrooms barely large enough for their beds and a kitchen that required them to coordinate movements to avoid collision. The apartment cost $1,800 monthly, consuming most of what remained after legal fees and the restitution payments that would follow him for the next decade. Vivian occupied the 2nd bedroom, her presence transforming the already cramped quarters into something approaching unbearable. She had sold most of her jewelry to cover moving expenses, keeping only the pieces that held sentimental value or were too modest to generate meaningful cash. The pearl necklace she had worn as a symbol of social arrival now lived in a drawer, unworn because there were no longer events requiring its appearance. Tristan's car, the Camry that had replaced the Audi when the lease terminated, sat in the parking lot with an inspection sticker that would expire in 2 weeks and money to renew it that didn't exist in any accessible account. He worked as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping company, the kind of mid-level position that required competence, but offered no path to advancement. His salary was $43,000 annually, enough to survive but insufficient to escape. The 3 of them gathered around a kitchen table designed for 2, the email displayed on Lawrence's laptop screen. Vivian's fingers drummed against the laminate surface, a nervous habit that had emerged in recent months and showed no signs of abating. "She's going to gloat, show us the empire we never knew existed, and make us grovel." Her voice carried the brittleness of someone maintaining composure through force of will. "We should refuse, send the lawyers without us. The lawyers cost $300 an hour. We can't afford to have them sit in a conference room while Naomi enjoys making us wait." Lawrence's pragmatism had sharpened during months of navigating consequences that compounded daily. "We go. We listen. We sign whatever she puts in front of us and we leave." Tristan stared at his hands, the fingers that had once signed contracts worth millions now rough from loading boxes during overtime shifts that paid time and a half. "Maybe she'll offer visitation. With the baby, Grace, my daughter's name is Grace and I've never seen her." The hope in his voice was painful to witness, the desperate grasping of a man who had lost everything and convinced himself that scraps might constitute redemption. Thursday arrived with weather that couldn't decide between spring sunshine and winter's final protest, clouds racing across the sky like they were fleeing something. The Camry made the drive to Manhattan with the kind of mechanical reluctance that suggested expensive repairs lurked in the immediate future, grinding gears and hesitant acceleration telegraphing the vehicle's decline into obsolescence. Sterling Tower rose 92 stories into the uncertain sky, glass and steel reflecting clouds that made the building appear to be dissolving at its upper reaches. The Ashfords entered through the main lobby, no service entrance this time, no attempt to hide their arrival, and approached the security desk where John had worked since before any of them knew Naomi existed. Recognition flickered across his face, quickly suppressed behind professional neutrality. "The Ashford party, you're expected. Elevator bank C, top floor. You've been cleared for executive suite access." The elevator climbed in silence, the only sound the mechanical hum of machinery moving them upward through a building that represented everything they had believed themselves entitled to, and discovered they had never earned. Vivian checked her reflection in the polished doors, adjusting a scarf that couldn't quite hide how much weight she had lost. How the stress had carved new lines around her mouth that no amount of cosmetics could fully conceal. The doors opened onto the 91st floor, revealing a reception area that managed to communicate power through understatement. No ostentatious displays, just clean lines, expensive materials, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing everyone who mattered already understood what this space represented. Edward Pierce waited near the conference room entrance, his navy suit as impeccable as the last time they had seen him, his expression professionally neutral. "The family is already assembled, if you'll follow me." The conference room stretched 30 feet, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Manhattan that reduced the city to a model of itself. Distances compressed into something comprehensible. The table could seat 20 but currently held only 5. Naomi at the head, Carmen Ortiz to her right, 2 attorneys flanking Edward's empty seat, and 1 chair conspicuously vacant across from Naomi. Clinton Davis sat in that vacant chair, transformed from the delivery driver who had offered his truck's warmth into someone wearing a suit that fit properly and an expression of calm authority. His presence was deliberate provocation, a reminder that kindness without calculation carried more value than lineage or social position. Naomi had changed since the Christmas gala, though pregnancy alone couldn't account for the difference. She was 8 months along now, her belly prominent beneath a tailored maternity dress in charcoal gray. But the real transformation lived in her eyes, in the way she held herself, not the careful invisibility of her marriage years nor the shocked hurt of her departure, but something harder and clearer. She gestured to 3 chairs opposite her position. "Please sit." They sat, the chairs comfortable but lower than Naomi's, a subtle height differential that meant they were looking up at her, a reversal of every family dinner where she had occupied the least desirable seat. "Before we discuss settlement terms, I want to introduce Clinton Davis formally. He's the Director of Community Outreach for Sterling Foundation, responsible for overseeing the Grace House Community Center." She paused, letting the name register. The center that now occupies the property at 412 Maple Ridge Drive. The address that had been their home for 20 years, converted into something that would serve people Vivian had spent her life trying to distinguish herself from. The symbolism burned more than the loss itself. "Clinton will be your primary contact regarding any matters related to Grace House. Should you wish to volunteer, donate, or participate in any of our programs, his office will coordinate." The offer was genuine but structured to ensure maximum discomfort. They could engage with what had been their home only by serving people they had previously looked down upon. Clinton's voice was warm, but carried the authority of someone who had earned rather than inherited his position. "We opened 3 weeks ago, currently housing 8 single mothers and their children. Job training starts next month, childcare services beginning in April. The response has exceeded expectations." Lawrence's jaw worked as he processed this information, calculating the operational costs, imagining strangers living in rooms where his family had celebrated holidays and anniversaries. His fingers gripped the table edge hard enough that his knuckles whitened. Edward distributed document folders, the covers embossed with Sterling Holdings logo. Final settlement terms. Everything outlined is non-negotiable, but I'll summarize the key provisions. Tristan opened his folder first, eyes tracking across pages with the desperate speed of someone searching for escape clauses that didn't exist. The child custody arrangement allocated full legal and physical custody to Naomi, with Tristan receiving supervised visitation every other Saturday for 4 hours contingent on sobriety testing and psychological evaluation demonstrating stability. $1,200 monthly for child support. His voice emerged hollow. I'm barely surviving on what I make now. After rent and this payment, you'll adjust your lifestyle accordingly. Naomi's tone allowed no room for negotiation. The amount is calculated using standard state guidelines based on your current income, not the inflated salary Sterling subsidies created. It's exactly what any other non-custodial parent in your income bracket would pay. The divorce decree finalized property division. Naomi retained everything. Tristan left with his personal effects and the Camry that was consuming its final miles. No alimony, no division of assets, nothing that acknowledged the 3 years of marriage beyond the child support obligation. Lawrence's section addressed the pension fund restitution and permanent prohibition from fiduciary roles. The SEC had accepted his cooperation in exchange for 18 months probation and 200 hours community service, lenience that existed only because Sterling Holdings had already made the victims whole. You'll never manage money professionally again. The prohibition is permanent and will follow you regardless of where you apply for employment. Edward's delivery remained clinical. However, you're free to work in any capacity that doesn't involve financial oversight or corporate governance. I've been in logistics management for 40 years. This effectively ends my career. It ends your ability to hold positions of trust you demonstrated yourself unworthy of. Your knowledge and experience remain applicable in advisory or operational roles that don't require fiduciary responsibility. Vivian's folder contained the thinnest documentation. No criminal charges, no legal prohibitions, just the systematic withdrawal of social infrastructure that had supported her for 2 decades. The country club membership had already lapsed when Sterling Foundation sponsorship ended. The charitable committee appointments had evaporated when the phone calls that had greased her entry stopped coming. She existed now in a social limbo, not explicitly excluded but no longer included, tolerated when encountered but not invited when events required curated guest lists. There's nothing here about me because there doesn't need to be. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had recognized her punishment as more subtle and more complete than legal consequences. You've already destroyed everything that mattered. I removed support you mistook for achievement. What remains is what you actually built through your own efforts. If that equals nothing, I didn't destroy it. I revealed it. The words hit with the precision of a surgical strike, laying bare the fundamental truth that Vivian had spent months trying to deny. She had been tolerated because Sterling money made tolerating her worthwhile. Without that incentive, people who had pretended to be her friends discovered they had other commitments, conflicting schedules, full tables that somehow couldn't accommodate one more. Naomi shifted in her chair, one hand moving to support her lower back in a gesture that betrayed discomfort she was trying to conceal. The 7-day notice to vacate has obviously passed. You're out of the house and Grace House is operational. The question now is whether you want any relationship with my daughter. Our daughter. Tristan's voice cracked on the words. She's my daughter too. Biologically, yes. But Grace will grow up knowing that character matters more than genetics. That being her father requires more than contributing DNA. Naomi produced another document, this one not included in the settlement folders. I'm willing to grant supervised visitation starting when she's 6 months old. Every other Saturday, 4 hours at Grace House under Clinton's supervision. You'll have the opportunity to be part of her life if you can demonstrate stability. The offer was simultaneously generous and devastating. Tristan could see his daughter, but only in the house he had lost. Only under the supervision of a man who had shown more integrity in one moment than Tristan had managed in 3 years. Only if he could prove himself worthy of trust he had already violated. And if I can't, if the evaluation determines I'm not stable enough, then you'll have financial obligations but no parental rights beyond what the court mandates. Grace will know she has a biological father who chose poorly when given the chance to choose well. She'll understand that some men fail tests and learn from the failure, while others simply fail. The distinction carried the weight of prophecy, a future being written in real time where Grace would grow up understanding that her father had been tested and found wanting, that his absence would be explained not as tragedy but as consequence. Lawrence cleared his throat, the sound of a man who had spent months rehearsing words he wasn't certain he could deliver. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for getting caught, not for the consequences I'm facing. I'm sorry for how we treated you. How I enabled Vivian to diminish you. How I stayed silent when Tristan made choices I knew were wrong. I'm sorry Grace will grow up knowing her grandfather as someone who stole from his employees' retirement. The apology was imperfect, contaminated by self-interest, and delivered too late to change outcomes, but it was also genuine in the way that admissions extracted by consequence sometimes achieve authenticity that voluntary confession never reaches. Naomi studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I accept your apology for what it is. Regret about outcomes rather than genuine remorse about actions. But I appreciate the honesty of admitting you're sorry you got caught rather than pretending you're sorry you did it. Vivian's face flushed, the color rising in blotches that cosmetics couldn't hide. You want me to apologize? For what? For expecting my son to marry someone appropriate? For trying to maintain standards in a world that increasingly has none? For believing that breeding and background matter? I want nothing from you. Naomi's voice dropped to something quieter and somehow more final than anger. You've already given me everything I needed. The certainty that my father was right, that most people can't afford patience because they're too busy calculating immediate advantage. That character reveals itself most clearly when it believes no one of consequence is watching. The silence that followed carried the weight of judgment delivered and accepted, the kind of quiet that precedes doors closing with finality. Carmen spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice carrying the warm efficiency of someone concluding business. The settlement agreements require signatures by 5 p.m. tomorrow. You can review with your attorneys, but as Edward mentioned, the terms are non-negotiable. Sign and file, or we proceed with contested proceedings that will cost you legal fees you can't afford and result in identical outcomes. The meeting concluded 10 minutes later, final details addressed, paperwork distributed, the machinery of legal dissolution grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. The Ashfords stood, 3 people who had entered the building as a family unit and would leave as individuals bound by shared failure rather than mutual support. Tristan paused at the conference room door, turning back toward Naomi with the desperate hope of a man grasping for something to salvage from wreckage. Can I ask one question, not about the settlement or visitation or any of this? You can ask. Why? If you had all this money, all this power, why did you stay for 3 years? You could have left any time. You could have... I stayed because I loved you, because I wanted to believe that the man who saved my laptop in a coffee shop still existed somewhere beneath your mother's expectations. Because my father taught me that patience is the most expensive thing in this world to own. And I wanted to spend that currency on believing you might choose me over approval. She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. I gave you 3 years to prove him wrong. You proved him right instead. They left without responding. What response could exist to the simple truth delivered without malice or satisfaction? just the factual recitation of opportunities offered and squandered. Naomi remained in the conference room after they departed, staring at the city below where 8 million people conducted their daily business of survival and ambition, and the endless calculation of what they owed each other. Carmen and Edward had followed the Ashfords out, giving her space to process, leaving only Clinton, who sat quietly reviewing program reports for Grace House. "You did the right thing, offering visitation." His voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had seen enough of life to understand that right actions didn't always feel good. "Grace deserves the chance to know her father, even if he doesn't deserve the chance to know her. You think he'll take it? The evaluation, the supervised visits, the constant reminder that he's there on sufferance rather than right? I think he'll try. Whether he'll succeed is a different question." Clinton set down the reports, his attention shifting fully to her. "But you've given him something most people never get, the opportunity to fail upward, to become better than he was because the consequences of staying the same are too painful to endure." 6 months passed in the peculiar acceleration of time that accompanies major life transitions. Naomi's pregnancy reached its natural conclusion on a Tuesday in late June. Contractions beginning at 3 a.m. with the kind of relentless progression that left no doubt about their purpose. She drove herself to the hospital. Carmen had offered to stay with her during the final weeks, but Naomi had declined, wanting this experience to be hers alone, unmediated by well-meaning friends or hired assistants. The hospital staff recognized her immediately, the Sterling Foundation's logo appearing on half the building's wing, but treated her with the same professional efficiency they extended to every patient. Grace arrived at 2:17 p.m. after 11 hours of labor that tested Naomi's patience in ways that had nothing to do with strategic thinking and everything to do with the simple biological reality of bringing life into the world. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, healthy lungs demonstrating immediate functionality through cries that carried the indignation of someone forcibly relocated from comfortable darkness into harsh light. The nurse placed Grace on Naomi's chest, skin to skin, and the world recalibrated around this small person who had spent 9 months as abstract future and now existed as present reality. Grace's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but searching, and Naomi felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what mattered. "Your grandpa would have loved you." The words emerged as whisper meant only for Grace, who couldn't yet understand language but might somehow absorb meaning. "He spent 40 years building something real because he understood that wealth without wisdom creates monsters. He wanted you to know that your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your last name or how many people recognize you when you walk into a room." Here she spent the first night alone with Grace, declining offers from Carmen and Edward to stay, wanting these hours to belong only to them. Grace nursed with the determined efficiency of someone who had figured out the basics and saw no reason to overcomplicate the process. She slept in fits and starts, waking every 2 hours with demands that were simple and absolute: food, comfort, clean diapers, the reassurance of presence. In the gaps between Grace's needs, Naomi dozed and woke and thought about her father's test, the 3 years she had spent waiting to see if Tristan would love her without knowing her worth. She had failed to find what she sought, authentic connection uncontaminated by calculation. But she had discovered something else, something her father probably anticipated even if she hadn't. She had learned exactly what she refused to tolerate, what dignity cost to maintain when everyone around you suggested surrender might be easier. What patience felt like when deployed not as passive waiting, but as active choice to see a situation through to clarity rather than abandoning it in ambiguity. The phone on her bedside table buzzed with messages she didn't read, well wishes from people whose names she recognized but whose faces remained abstractions. The only message she opened came from Clinton, brief and warm. "Congratulations, boss. Grace House is here whenever you're ready. No rush." She was discharged Thursday afternoon, Grace secured in a car seat that had required watching 3 instructional videos to install correctly, both of them heading to the brownstone in Brooklyn that Naomi had purchased specifically because it was modest, comfortable, and required no staff to maintain. The neighborhood was quietly diverse, professionals and families and people who worked hard to create stable lives from circumstances that didn't automatically grant stability. No one recognized her on the street. No one cared that the woman carrying groceries while wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt happened to own buildings visible from her front stoop. Carmen visited on Sundays with homemade food and stories from Sterling Holdings that reminded Naomi the company continued functioning whether she micromanaged or trusted the people she had hired. Edward stopped by Wednesday evenings with legal documents requiring signature and updates on Hartford family investigations that were progressing exactly as anticipated. But mostly Naomi's world contracted to the rhythms of caring for an infant who didn't know or care about her mother's net worth, who demanded attention based solely on need and rewarded it with the simple gift of existence. Grace's first smile arrived at 6 weeks, triggered by nothing more profound than successful digestion. Her first laugh emerged at 8 weeks, surprised out of her by the discovery that her own hands existed and could be manipulated. Tristan's first supervised visitation occurred when Grace reached exactly 6 months old. The psychological evaluation having determined he presented no danger to the child and demonstrated sufficient stability to warrant contact. Clinton supervised in one of Grace House's common rooms, toys scattered across a carpet that had once been the Ashford family's formal living room. Tristan arrived 10 minutes early carrying a wooden toy he had carved himself, an elephant with exaggerated ears and a trunk that curved upward. The craftsmanship was rough but genuine, the kind of gift that required effort rather than money. He sat on the floor while Clinton placed Grace on a playmat, her 6-month-old body capable of rolling and sitting but not yet mobile enough to escape. Tristan watched her with the desperate fascination of someone being granted access to something precious they knew they didn't deserve. "She has your eyes." His voice barely rose above whisper, as if speaking louder might break the spell that allowed him to be there. Grace regarded him with the frank assessment of an infant deciding whether this new person warranted trust. She reached for the wooden elephant, her grip clumsy but determined, and Tristan's face showed the kind of naked joy that couldn't be faked. Clinton documented the visit with the thoroughness of someone who understood his observations would determine future access. Tristan held Grace for 20 minutes, supporting her head correctly, responding to her needs with attention that suggested he had watched instructional videos or read books or otherwise attempted to prepare. When the 4 hours concluded, surrendering Grace back to Clinton's care clearly took physical effort. Tristan's hands trembled as he passed her over, his eyes tracking her as Clinton secured her in the car seat Naomi had provided. "Next visit is 2 weeks from now. Same time, same place. Same. Keep up with the counseling and the random drug tests and we can continue this schedule." Clinton's tone was neither warm nor cold, simply factual. "Miss your appointments or test positive for anything and visitation suspends immediately." "I understand. And Clinton, thank you for giving me this chance. I'm not giving you anything. Naomi is, and you're not receiving a gift. You're being allowed to fulfill the minimum obligations of fatherhood under supervised conditions. Don't confuse access with redemption." 8 months after Grace's birth, Naomi found herself in a bookstore in the West Village on a Saturday afternoon that had no agenda beyond browsing. Grace was with Carmen, giving Naomi rare hours to herself, time that felt both liberating and slightly uncomfortable in its lack of structure. She drifted toward the architecture section, drawn by a display about sustainable urban design that aligned with Sterling Foundation's latest initiatives. Her hand reached for a book on affordable housing innovations. At the same moment, another hand touched the same spine from the opposite direction. "Sorry, you were here first." The voice belonged to a man in his mid-30s, Asian American wearing jeans and a faded Northwestern sweatshirt that suggested either genuine affiliation or really committed thrift store shopping. "No, please, I was just browsing." She pulled her hand back, but something about the interaction felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with rhythm. He smiled, the gesture reaching his eyes in a way that suggested it was habitual rather than performative. "Tell you what, rock, paper, scissors for it?" The absurdity made her laugh, actual laughter that came from somewhere genuine rather than polite. "That's probably the most reasonable solution to book competition I've encountered." They played. She won with paper over his rock. He conceded defeat gracefully, then gestured to the coffee shop next door. "Can I buy the victor a coffee to soothe my wounded ego?" She should have said no. Should have remembered Edward's warnings about how people would approach her now that her identity was public knowledge, how every interaction carried the potential for calculation disguised as coincidence. But something about his smile and his ridiculous solution to book scarcity suggested someone who hadn't performed cost-benefit analysis before offering coffee. Coffee would be nice. They talked for an hour in a corner booth that had seen countless conversations between strangers negotiating whether to become something more. His name was Julian Cross, and he designed affordable housing for a nonprofit based in Brooklyn. He was passionate about creating spaces that dignified their inhabitants, about the ways architecture could either reinforce or challenge social hierarchies. He asked what she did for a living, the question casual rather than loaded. Naomi hesitated, 3 years of hiding her identity flashing through memory like a warning. The old instinct to deflect, to minimize, to make herself smaller rose up strong enough that she almost deployed it. Then she took a breath and chose truth. "I run a foundation, large one actually, the Sterling Foundation." His eyebrows rose, recognition flickering across his features. "Oh, wow, that's..." He paused, recalibrating. "That's impressive. Also explains why you were looking at affordable housing books. We've worked with Sterling Foundation grants on 3 projects. Does that change things?" She braced herself for the shift, the moment when Julian Cross stopped seeing her and started seeing what she represented. He considered the question with genuine thought rather than reflexive reassurance. "Well, I was going to offer to buy your coffee, but now I'm wondering if I should let you get the check." The honesty made her laugh again, real and surprised. "How about we split it?" 6 weeks later found them in Naomi's Brooklyn kitchen on a Friday evening. Grace and her bouncer making the satisfied noises of a baby who had been fed and changed and was content to observe adults navigating their own feeding rituals. Julian had cooked pasta that was competent if uninspired. Naomi had contributed wine that cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Though she hadn't mentioned the price, Carmen sat across from them. Her presence both chaperone and friend, someone who had watched Naomi navigate enough complications to warrant inclusion in New Beginnings. Edward had declined the invitation, citing case preparation, though everyone understood he was simply giving them space. Julian didn't know the difference between designer labels and department store brands. He drove a Subaru Outback that was older than some of the interns at Sterling Foundation. He couldn't name a single hedge fund manager or private equity firm, and his retirement planning consisted of hoping the nonprofit's 401k match would somehow compound into sufficiency. But he asked about her day every evening they spoke, and he listened to the answers with attention that suggested he cared about the details. He remembered that Grace preferred her mobile turn to the elephant setting. He noticed when Naomi was tired and suggested they reschedule rather than pushing through for the sake of plans. He loved her, or was beginning to, not for the foundation or the buildings or the name that appeared on charitable donor lists. He loved her because she made him laugh, because she could discuss architecture with genuine interest. Because she was kind to servers and patient with slow elevators and completely unimpressed by professional credentials. Naomi looked around the table at the people she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. Carmen, who had stood beside her through board betrayals and media attacks. Edward, who had executed her father's plan while respecting her autonomy. Julian, who knew exactly who she was and loved her anyway. Grace, who demanded nothing beyond presence and gave everything in return. Her father had told her to find someone who didn't know who she was to test whether authentic love could exist across the barrier of wealth. He had been wrong about the methodology, but right about the principle. The right person wasn't someone who didn't know who you were. The right person was someone who knew exactly who you were, the good and the broken and the complicated, and chose you anyway. Not because of what you owned or controlled or could provide, but because of who you became when everything else fell away. Julian's hand found hers under the table, the gesture casual and warm. Grace squeaked from her bouncer, demanding attention through sheer force of personality. Carmen raised her glass in a toast that required no words because everyone present understood what they were celebrating. The Sterling Foundation Gala at the Plaza Hotel had become an annual event, the kind of gathering that attracted senators and CEOs and people whose influence shaped policy from positions the general public rarely recognized. This year's gala fell on the first Saturday in December, exactly 1 year after the Christmas gathering that had transformed Naomi's life from private struggle to public reckoning. She stood backstage reviewing her keynote speech on a tablet, the words refined through multiple drafts until they carried exactly the message she intended. Grace was with Carmen in the green room, 11 months old and remarkably patient with the chaos of event preparation. Julian waited in the audience somewhere, uncomfortable in formal wear but present because she had asked. The stage manager gave her the 2-minute warning. Naomi set down the tablet, checked her reflection in a mirror that showed a woman who bore resemblance to the person who had stood barefoot in the snow a year ago, but had been fundamentally restructured by the weight of consequence and choice. She walked to the wings waiting for her introduction and saw something that stopped her completely. Among the catering staff circulating through the ballroom with trays of champagne and canapes, wearing an ill-fitting uniform that pulled across his shoulders and stopped too short at the ankles, Tristan Ashford navigated between tables with the careful precision of someone trying to be invisible. Clinton appeared at her elbow, his expression apologetic. "I didn't know until an hour ago. The catering agency sent him. He took the job for $100 cash. Didn't check which event he'd be working. He tried to leave when he realized, but they threatened to withhold payment if he abandoned his shift." Naomi watched Tristan serve champagne to people who didn't recognize him, who had no idea that the man refilling their glasses had once occupied their world, had lost access through failures too fundamental to overcome with charm or pedigree. His face showed the careful blankness of someone performing a role while trying not to think about what the performance cost. Should I have security remove him? She considered. Removing him would be mercy disguised as cruelty, sparing him the humiliation of serving at an event celebrating the foundation built from the wreckage of his family's pretensions. Allowing him to stay would force him to witness exactly what he had thrown away, to serve champagne to a woman who had once loved him, and now regarded him with the distant concern reserved for strangers experiencing misfortune. Let him work, but assign him to table 1. Clinton's eyebrows rose. Are you certain? He chose to take this job. He chose every step that led to needing it. Let him see what those choices cost. She turned away from the ballroom toward the stage entrance. And Clinton, make sure he gets his $100. I'm not interested in petty cruelty. Her introduction began, the master of ceremonies delivering biographical highlights that transformed her father's journey from janitor to billionaire into mythology people could believe in. She walked onto the stage, applause building from polite acknowledgement into genuine warmth. 650 people standing to honor someone who had used wealth to create rather than simply consume. The speech she had prepared focused on value, not market value or asset value, but human value, the kind that couldn't be quantified on balance sheets or measured in quarterly earnings. We live in a world obsessed with price. We can tell you what everything costs: houses, cars, education, healthcare, but we've forgotten how to discuss what anything is worth. Her voice carried across the ballroom, amplified by speakers but drawing power from conviction rather than volume. I learned the difference between price and worth from my father, who understood that the most expensive thing in this world isn't a private jet or a mansion or a rare painting. The most expensive thing in this world is patience, and most people simply can't afford to own it. In the shadows near the service entrance, Tristan stood frozen, his tray of champagne forgotten. The words landed like physical blows, each sentence a reminder of tests failed and opportunities squandered. My father waited 40 years to build something real. He could have cut corners, leveraged his assets recklessly, prioritized growth over sustainability. But he understood that anything worth having requires patience, not as passive waiting, but as active choice to let situations develop to clarity rather than forcing premature resolution. She spoke for 12 minutes, weaving her father's philosophy with the Foundation's mission, connecting individual stories of people helped by Grace House and similar programs to the broader question of how societies decide who matters. The audience listened with the kind of attention that transcended politeness. People genuinely engaged with ideas that challenged their comfortable assumptions. When the speech concluded, the applause carried a different quality than the opening ovation. Not just appreciation for a performance, but recognition of truth delivered without apology or qualification. She descended from the stage, returning to table 1 where Carmen and Julian waited alongside Edward and Clinton. The catering manager signaled to Tristan, gesturing toward their table. Time to refill glasses, perform service, pretend he was invisible while being completely exposed. Tristan approached with the mechanical precision of someone who had practiced not thinking about what they were doing. He filled Carmen's glass, the champagne bubbling golden in crystal. He moved to Edward, then Clinton, each pour executed with the kind of attention that came from knowing any mistake would be noted. Then he reached Naomi. His hand trembled as he lifted the bottle, champagne sloshing against the sides but not quite spilling. The bottle clinked against her glass twice, the sound sharp enough to draw attention from neighboring tables. He poured, the liquid rising to precisely the correct level, muscle memory from some previous version of himself operating his hands while his mind struggled with the reality of what he had become. She waited until he finished, letting the silence extend until it became unbearable. Then she looked up, making eye contact for the first time in a year, and spoke 2 words that carried the weight of finality. "Thank you." Not grateful, not warm, just professionally polite. The tone someone might use with a competent but unfamiliar service provider. Complete indifference wrapped in courtesy. The kind of dismissal that hurt more than anger or contempt because it communicated that he no longer mattered enough to generate emotion. Tristan's face showed the slow-motion collapse of someone who had maintained hope, however unrealistic, that some trace of what they had shared might remain. That indifference erased, reducing 3 years of marriage and a child to a professional exchange between strangers. "Is there anything else, ma'am?" His voice cracked on the question, the break barely perceptible but present. Naomi paused, seeming to consider. She saw the tear tracking down his cheek, saw the cheap suit and the desperate hope and the ruins of a man who had valued approval over love. She could destroy him with 1 word, 1 announcement to the room about who he was and what he had lost, but she was building something better than destruction. Grace House existed to help people recover from failures, to offer second chances to those who had been dismissed by systems that valued credentials over character. Her daughter would grow up in a world that understood mercy as strength rather than weakness. No, that will be all. He stood for 1 more breath, perhaps hoping she might add something, might acknowledge that he had once been her husband, might offer some pathway back to significance. But Naomi had already turned to her conversation with Julian, something about building codes and sustainability standards, her attention completely withdrawn. Tristan walked back through the kitchen, past prep stations and dishwashers, through the service door into an alley where December rain fell with the same relentless determination it had shown a year ago. He stood in it, let it soak through the borrowed uniform, pulled out his wallet to count the single $20 bill that represented his evening's wages. Inside the ballroom, Naomi raised her glass as Julian said something that made Carmen laugh. The sound of people who had chosen each other building something real from the raw materials of genuine connection. Grace was asleep in the green room, dreaming whatever 11-month-olds dreamed, safe and loved and completely unaware that her father had just served champagne to her mother while dressed as invisible labor. 8 months later, on a Sunday morning that arrived with the kind of sunshine that made promises about summer, Naomi stood in her Brooklyn brownstone kitchen making coffee, while Grace demonstrated her newly mastered walking skills. 11 steps had been yesterday's record. Today she was attempting 12, wobbling between furniture pieces with the determined optimism of someone who hadn't yet learned to fear falling. Julian sat at the kitchen table reviewing plans for a housing development that Sterling Foundation was partially funding, his pencil making notes in margins while he simultaneously kept one eye on Grace's progress. Carmen would arrive soon with bagels and updates from Sterling Holdings' quarterly board meeting, the company having learned to function with Naomi's guidance rather than requiring her constant presence. The mail arrived through the slot in the front door, a cascade of envelopes that was mostly junk but occasionally contained something worth attention. Naomi sorted through it while her coffee brewed, setting aside solicitations and advertisements until one envelope stopped her. Handwritten address, no return label, postmark from Connecticut. She opened it standing in the hallway, Grace's excited babbling providing soundtrack as she successfully navigated 12 steps and immediately attempted 13. Inside, a single sheet of paper containing 3 sentences in handwriting that had become unfamiliar through a year of absence. I should have chosen you. I should have defended you against my mother, against my own weakness, against everything that told me approval mattered more than love. I'm sorry that Grace will grow up knowing her father failed the only test that mattered. No signature, no request for response, just acknowledgement delivered too late to change outcomes but soon enough to matter in some minimal way. Naomi read it twice, feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness. Tristan's failures had consequences that apologies couldn't erase. Not satisfaction. His suffering gave her no pleasure. Something closer to recognition that he had finally understood what he had lost, that the lesson had landed even if it couldn't be unlearned. She placed the letter in a drawer in her office, filed alongside legal documents and tax returns and other papers that documented the architecture of her life. Grace might ask about her father someday, might want to understand the man who contributed half her genetics but minimal presence in her daily reality. When that day came, this letter would be part of the story. Evidence that Tristan had eventually recognized his failure, even if that recognition arrived too late to prevent it. Julian appeared in the doorway, carrying Grace, who had finally worn herself out with ambulatory adventures. Everything okay? Everything's fine. Just someone acknowledging a debt that can't be repaid. He didn't press. Had learned during their months together that Naomi would share what she was ready to share, and attempts to force disclosure before she reached that point only delayed it. He settled Grace in her high chair, began preparing the banana slices she demanded with imperious hand gestures. Carmen arrived 10 minutes later, bagels in one arm and her tablet in the other, already narrating quarterly highlights before she had fully entered the kitchen. Revenue up 18%. The Clean Energy Initiative exceeded projections again, and 3 board members want to expand into European markets, but I told them you'd need to sign off on anything that significant. They ate breakfast together, the 3 adults and one extremely opinionated toddler, discussing business and housing policy and whether Grace's newfound walking ability meant childproofing needed to escalate to the next level. Normal morning conversation among people who had built trust slowly, testing it through accumulated small choices rather than demanding it arrive fully formed. Naomi's phone buzzed with a message from Clinton. Grace House annual report finished. 23 families housed this year, 84% employment rate within 6 months. Waiting list is 67 applicants. Good problem to have. She thought about the house that had been the Ashford family home, now serving people who had been dismissed by circumstances beyond their control. About rooms where she had been made to feel inferior, now hosting programs designed to affirm dignity. About the slow transformation of spaces from sites of humiliation to centers of hope. Her father had been right about patience being expensive, but he had also understood something she was only now fully grasping, that the most expensive thing to own wasn't the patience itself, but the wisdom to know when waiting had reached its natural conclusion, when the test had been completed and the results were clear enough that continuing it would be cruelty rather than thoroughness. She had waited 3 years for Tristan to choose her. When he chose his mother's approval instead, she had waited another year for the legal and social machinery to complete its work. Now she was waiting for Grace to grow up in a world that understood worth couldn't be inherited, only demonstrated. That dignity was free, available to anyone who claimed it. That love without calculation was rare but real, and worth the patience required to find it. Julian reached across the table, his hand finding hers with the casual certainty of someone who knew the gesture would be welcomed. Grace threw a piece of banana at the wall, discovered the satisfying splat it made, and prepared to throw another before Carmen intervened. The morning stretched ahead of them, full of small choices and accumulated moments that would build into something worth having. Outside, Brooklyn woke to another Sunday. People walking dogs, buying newspapers, navigating their own versions of consequence and choice. Inside, Naomi whispered to Grace while Julian cleared plates and Carmen argued with someone on her phone about European market analysis. "We're going to be okay, baby girl. We already are."